Good morning, everyone. So we've got a few attendees today. Thank you for joining us for the last office hours for Advanced Locals State Dollars Middle Mile program. Just as a quick reminder, I'm sure you all know. So Monday, June 29th is our final submission date. I believe that's going to be at midnight, so 11:59. We'll need to see all of your applications submitted, and then we will shut the portal then. And that will kickstart the review and challenge process that we have built into the system. But I want to kind of open this up today. I'm taking over for Stephen for today. So if there's questions you have, anything we need to cover, we'll do our best. And if we can't answer that right now, we'll get back to you either today or tomorrow at the latest. So quick agenda notice. Oh, yeah, just let me get through this and then we'll take on questions. Absolutely. So we'll do a quick announcement for Tier 2, if you haven't seen that. So we're very excited to get Tier 2 opened as well on Monday. So that'll be June 29th. We do have a webinar for that. We'll cover the timeline again very quickly, a couple simple reminders, and any noteworthy changes, and take on any questions you have. So, Shaq, did you have a question?
Yeah, I've actually got three as soon as you're ready for them. So I can rapid fire or give you one, give you time to answer, and then give you the next, whichever method works better for you.
Okay. Kristen, can we jump to the timeline and then I'll take those. How's that sound?
Perfect.
All right. So as I mentioned, Tier 2 is opening on Monday, June 29th. We have a webinar scheduled for 11 a.m. on Monday. There's an opportunity for Stephen to share with you some of the nuances and the in and outs. Ideally, our focus for Tier 2 is getting covering the categories of last mile projects, which is a big thing I know everyone's interested in, short-term construction and non-deployment, two of our new project categories that we're very excited to share with you and open up for funding. So we will have user guides ready for these, ideally on Monday. They're still in the works, but we're still planning on getting those ready for Monday. And then the addendums are up on our website, and any of the resource materials you'll need are there as well. So yeah, please join us for Monday if you're interested in learning about the Tier 2 Advanced Local Program. Next slide. So the timeline very quickly, we are getting into, gosh, I can't believe it's almost July. Jeez, where did 2026? Every year it goes quickly, but this one is going particularly fast. So our window closes. We'll publish our intent to award list after review. There will be advanced local work group sessions that are publicly available, so you'll be able to attend those and listen in. We'll cover the appeal window as well. We'll publish any of those results, and ideally by October 25th, this is a good deadline we've set ourselves. We'll execute the agreements for the middle mile. And just FYI, we'll cover the last mile or Tier 2 timeline in the webinar on Monday. So it's a little bit different from this one. So yeah, Shaq, you want to fire them off?
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and thank you to the whole team for being here and for taking questions. Um, we're looking at purchasing an IRU with the middle mile, not with the tier two. And in your FAQs 7.11, somebody had asked the question, can advance local grant funding be used to cover middle mile IRUs, leases, or right-of-way fees? The answer given says, a long-term lease is an operational expense. However, the portion directly applicable to bringing a CapEx project online may be allowable. An applicant must clearly explain which portion of the IRU or right-of-way lease is required for the capital expenditure, and account of the remaining costs is in the operational viability plan. Then it goes on to say, under no circumstances will funding for an IRU or right-of-way be allowed to exceed the period of performance of the grant. I'm thinking specifically of an IRU we need to get over Wolf Creek Pass. And as a capital expenditure, since CDOT has that fiber, that it's certainly cheaper to lease existing fiber and to uh, expend the money to put the optical and routing equipment either side on existing fiber than to construct 30 miles of fiber over some of the hardest terrain to build in the state, especially when we only need two strands. But my question would be, assuming that the IRU itself would be allowable, specific to the wording um, that in under no circumstances will funding for an IRU be allowed to exceed the period of performance of the grant. Um, is that specific to the funding or to the term of the IRU? In other words, could we purchase a typical 20-year IRU so long as all the funding was expended by the end of the 3 years or by September 1st, 2030?
Yeah, I think so. I love this question. It's definitely helpful to kind of give context. So thank you, Shaq. Um, I don't think we'd want to set you to the time of you can only buy, an IRU for the amount of time of the grant project. So I think you would definitely be able to purchase a 20-year IRU and then allocate funding, through showing it in your application through whatever additional documentation that you're using the funds specifically for this period of time. So we'd want to break down of that cost and a determination of, yeah, what the timeline looks like for how you're using the money. So,
So as long as the funds are expended by September 1st, 2030, the term of the IRU would be kind of
yeah,
irrelevant. Okay, so
I
it's a
mean, I think
bookkeeping
so.
thing.
Yeah, I don't think it's helpful for you all to have to buy a very specific type, which I mean, I can't imagine there's too many op situations where that would be feasible. It seems difficult. So I think we're okay with using the money for an IRU, but as long as it's within the period of performance, then that's something we could consider for to be allowable.
Great, thank you. My
Mhm.
second question is in the financial security portion of the guidance that requires a performance bond or letter of credit.
Mhm.
We could get a line of credit for the amount of our project, and that's probably not a problem. My question is, the performance bonds and letters of credit are generally for construction and with IRUs and capital equipment purchases. I'm not sure that's the right tool for financial assurance. Again, like I said, we can get a line of credit. I just don't
Mhm.
think an insurance company would even sell a performance bond I think the hardest part would be convincing a bank to give a line of credit when we're just making simple purchase transactions. Is there something else that if the insurance companies, banks push back because it's not a tool that's normally used for this type of thing, is there something that the CBO would consider another type of financial assurance for something that's not going to involve construction?
So I'm going to jump in, Brian, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
please. Please.
Shaq, we got that question and we just got the answer up, maybe today or yesterday. So I don't know if you saw it. I'm linking to it in the chat. And if your question still stands after reading that, then Brian, please go for it because I don't know any specifics, but we did address that.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a look at that. And
Okay, yeah.
then my last question, and I'll get out of your hair. And thank you for your patience with
It's all
all of
good.
this morning. Is in your workbook, you've got a section for indirect costs, but I couldn't find in the guidance a definition for what qualifies. Um, is that just like your well, I guess, can you give me a definition for what you consider indirect costs?
Um, Not off the top of my head, I can't. I honestly, I'd like to go back and just confirm with my colleagues. Can you give me 24 hours to get something into the FAQs on that?
Yep, that
So
would be great. Thank you.
thank you. Yeah, I think we're trying to be very open with the middle mile because it is such a broad situation, and we want to take most of, whatever gets submitted, we'll take it on a case by case basis and make sure we're doing what's right by everyone in Colorado and the applicants, and also kind of sticking to our side of compliance. So I think it's kind of broad, so I want to come back on that for you if that's okay.
Great, thank you. And
Yep.
thank you guys for everything you're doing with this. I know you're kind of inventing the airplane as you're flying it. So we're happy to be on the journey with you.
Awesome. We're glad to have you here. And it is a new journey for all of us, with the other part of CBO's middle mile thing. So we're all kind of mixing where we go and making sure we're doing what's most appropriate for Colorado. So thanks for all your feedback and thanks for your questions. These are really helpful to make sure we're doing it correctly. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think Chris, if we could just make a note to put that into the FAQs, that would be great.
Hey,
Sure
Brian.
thing.
Brian,
Yeah.
hey, this is Corey Brindle with Region 10.
Hey.
I just wanted to follow on Shaq's first question and just for my own edification, if I could get some
Yep.
clarity. I followed all of that, but when we buy an IRU, and we've done, I think, 40 of them, we typically buy them for, an extended period of time, like the maximum that we can fund,
Sure.
whether it's 10 years, 20 years, in some cases, 30 years. It's just the best deal we can get. So I just want
Sure.
to make sure that I'm understanding that we would make the purchase of the IRU during the performance period of the grant. But the actual term of the IRU, the asset we're buying, we want to get our most bang for the buck.
Of course.
So if it's a 20-year IRU for pick a number, $100, we would just simply need to expend that $100 during the performance period of the grant. We're not limiting the length of the IRU by the performance period of the grant.
No, and that is my understanding as well. That's how I think
Cool.
it should play out, is that we don't want to hinder you. You need to spend your money and this money in the most intelligent way or efficient way possible. So
Perfect.
I can't, and I don't know enough about IRUs to be um remotely, the subject matter expert on, but I think it makes sense to allow you to spend your money as efficiently as possible and then request and seek approval on using middle mile funds, these middle mile advanced local funds for whatever portion of the IRA you have that is part of the performance period. So, and you would want to make sure you're showing that in your budget. You'd want to cover that in any of the narratives or any additional documentation you provide and show evidence of here's the IRU, here's what we'd like to allocate towards it, this is what it's going to cover. So yeah, I think that makes the most sense for this program.
Okay, so just to restate, because that's a little bit different than what I had just
Oh, okay.
stated.
Yep, go ahead.
So if you buy the piece of paper that's an IRU and it's like an
Mhm.
asset, right? And it has a term of 20 years, we would purchase that piece of paper or that right to use during the 3 years, like, pretty quickly during the
Yep,
grant performance period. But the term of the IRU goes, as long as the asset, whatever that was defined in the IRU.
yeah,
If we want to be consistent with like other grants that we've used from DOLA and the feds and others, we just buy the IRU, the 20-year IRU, the actual asset during the grant, the time we can use the grant funds. But the grant term, I'm sorry, let me say that correctly. The IRU term is what's defined in the IRU. It's not that we're just covering like 3.5 years or 2.5 years of IRU with the grant funds. We actually use the grant funds for the full term of the IRU, but we make the purchase during the performance period of the grant.
okay. Yeah, so
And
we're
I can send that in
getting,
writing if it's helpful.
yeah, I think that's good. I'd like to take that back to Judd, if that's okay, just to confirm. So we're giving you the most accurate information. So, from a 30,000 foot level, you can use funds for during the performance period to cover the IRU through the performance period, and the rest would be on you. But I think,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
if you can send that in a question, we'll take that back to Judd and get back to you ASAP.
yeah, it's very similar to if we bought a physical asset, if we bought a cable, we wouldn't just
Mhm.
have the cable for the remaining 2.5 years. We'd have the cable, available to us throughout the remaining use of its life. And IRU is very
Right,
similar.
of course. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't want you to give up the IRU after the performance period, but I think we could cover a portion of it that is used during the project period. But again, yeah, let go back to Judd, make sure we get you an answer that makes
Okay,
sense. So
great. Thank you very much.
you're welcome. Um, Eric?
Yeah, I was just going to key off that something that it probably is a Judd question too. Um, but in my experience, what I've come up to understand of IRUs versus a lease, and a lease could very, reasonably be looked at as more operational costs, whereas an IRU really is as Corey mentioned several times, it's an asset. And
Yeah.
so that in I believe you treat it in your books as an asset, and you can depreciate it probably. I mean, you can do all the stuff that you would do with an asset. So it is different, and with the indefeasible right of use, it's not exactly a long-term lease, and that probably should be clarified because I've heard that, or at least I thought I read that in some of the FAQs of terming an IRU as a long-term lease, and it's a different animal.
Yes, yeah, that's I think we need to take these thoughts and questions back and make sure we're giving you an answer that makes sense. Yeah. IRAs they're complicated and we've had long discussions on these in the past, so we'll want to make sure we're as clear as possible for these. So, well, thanks for these questions. These are great. Okay. Um, any questions? I don't think there's any in the chat now. Does anyone have any other questions? I was excited to see there weren't too many technical assistance questions with the portal. It feels like, um, yeah, it may not be the best thing in the world. But it's not too bad. So we're hoping that it continues to be that. Craig, go ahead.
Hey, question from the first pages of the portal. Is the applicant a traditional or non-traditional broadband provider? So
Hmm.
that seems to be a head nod back to some of the BEAD language and getting at that. But what would be an answer to no for that question here?
Let
Who
me
would
go
be
back.
an who would be a no? Because I think the yes in BEAD terms was getting to the USF definition of traditional broadband provider, but then your non-traditional doesn't include like CLECs or others that may not be the USF variety.
Right. Let's go back and look at this. Feel like there is a comment that's added somewhere in the portal about what we designate as a traditional versus non-traditional. But if that, so the term non-traditional broadband provider means an electric cooperative, nonprofit organization, public-private partnership, public or private utility, public utility district, tribal entity, or local government. I can put this in the chat rather than boring you all. Give me 1 second. I'll put that in there. So this is what we have used.
Yeah, I see that, and so I
Yeah.
think if you answer in the affirmative, you're that or the traditional, but then who would be a no?
In terms of non-traditional,
Mm, well, the way it's worded is traditional or non-traditional. If you answer
right?
yes, you're one of that big bucket, but I just don't know what a no is. Is this getting at having a CPCN designation in Colorado? Is it getting at any other type of nuance?
No, that's a good question. I think this is something we probably will have to rework for the next cycle. Um, so let me chat with my colleagues and get back to you on that, what we're trying to get at here. So yeah, but I think you're right. It's probably a rollover that we should provide more context on. So um, yeah, give me 24 hours and see if I can get something back to you, if that's okay.
No problem. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's see, Mayank.
Hi, Brian. Thanks. I had a couple of questions. We had also sent an email earlier regarding community engagement narrative. So the I think the document, guideline document, essentially asks for a community engagement narrative. But on the
Mhm.
portal, there are a couple of yes and no questions, as well as place to upload letters of support, but there's no space for narrative. So should we be just uploading it as a PDF along with letters of support, or how does the broadband office want us to work through it?
Yeah, I think I understand. You're asking. You said you have additional letters of support. Is that what I heard? I'm sorry. I got
No,
distracted.
so there's as part of the guideline document, it asks for a community engagement narrative, uh, but there is no space on the portal to uh, write the narrative.
Oh, yes, that's a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, so I'm gonna hop in again if that's okay,
Thanks,
Brian.
Kristen. Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
no worries. We answered this one as well. And I will put the chat answer in the chat here or a link to it. And then if you still have a question,
Sure,
then
thank you.
feel free. But that just I think just went live, like I said, in the last day or so.
Got it. Thank you so much. I have one more question. It's probably a larger question related to what qualifies. We understand there's a tier two application process that will also start from next week. So we kind of wanted to understand what would be the better way. So we are thinking of upgrading our network equipment. So we work with the state of Colorado owned network called EagleNet, where we commercialize as well as operate and maintain the network. And it's pretty dated, and we've gotten a lot of requests from local stakeholders and Board of Educations and everywhere else to upgrade the network. Now, that's not directly fiber build out. So we wanted to understand, would that qualify under tier one or tier two as part of the middle mile process?
Yeah, we'll try and cover this, I think, on Monday's webinar, but I can try and quickly address this. It sounds, and feel free to send an email on this. We can certainly help make a determination, but it feels like more of a short-term construction upgrade situation. I'm just going back, and again, we'll cover these on Monday, but um, so the goal for short-term construction is make ready costs, construction of CNLs or IXPs, security of networks, cost associated with rip and replace, supporting shovel-ready projects that are essential to expanding network coverage where construction subsidies are needed to ensure operational viability. So from what I just heard, it seems like tier two might be most appropriate, but if you're not sure, then please like send off an email today so we can take a look and get back to you because yeah, Monday is the deadline. So I don't
Yeah,
want you to
right.
miss an opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah. So we'll probably send an email
Yeah.
if it's not already sent, and then we'll follow up on it.
Okay.
Uh,
Seems good.
that's helpful. And then, secondly, on the pool of funding itself, at one of the webinars earlier, you'd mentioned that there are $27 million available, of which 60% is middle mile. Uh, and then another portion of the guidelines mentions something about annual 14 or 15 million dollars of funding available. So there's a little bit of misunderstanding at our end. So just wanted to get clarification there.
Of course, no, and I thank you for that. It's not the easiest in terms of juggling it. So the high cost support mechanism, HCSM, hasn't really used much money just in terms of reimbursing current active grantees for the last few years. So we've built up a bit of a money pot. So we took a look in the spring to see how much money we had, and then according to the legislation, we had to divide it up 60% to middle mile, 40% can go to tier two in this sense, is what we're looking at. So currently, we have allocated. So we had about $36.7 million available for this first cycle, and we had to split that up. So we've got about, and it's, I think I misspoke in a previous webinar. So we have about 22 million for middle mile and 14.7 for tier two. So for this pot, yeah, I would say 22 million. If we don't spend it, that would roll over into other middle mile funding projects for the next cycle. I think that's how it works. I don't think I have a definitive answer on that, but it feels like if we allocate certain money for middle mile in this cycle, then that would roll over into the next cycle. So think about 22 million for this one, 14.7 for tier two.
Perfect. So just to be 100% clear, and this is very helpful, first of all, thank you. There is for this round of tier one middle mile funding that is open now, submission deadline for Monday, there's $22 million of funds available.
That is correct, yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Right. Well, again, thanks for these questions. They're really great. So we really do appreciate the opportunity to connect with you and make sure we're being clear, or if we need to provide more clarity, that's definitely important. And just so you know, we'll probably do something like this at the end of this cycle where we'll do an open forum of like how to go, what can we tweak, where do you think the priorities are? And, everyone has been really helpful in terms of sharing where they think we need to make priorities. Like, for example, multiple people accessing the application. That's a real simple fix. Well, we thought it was a simple fix, turns out not to be. So we're going to try and work on that for the next cycle. But again, appreciate all the questions. So does anyone have anything else they'd like us to address or we can
Yeah.
talk about?
Hey, Brian, Corey again.
Hey.
Sorry to jump on each of these. But
Oh,
yeah,
please.
one of the first eligible categories included electronics and equipment, and I think a couple of us are certainly intending to put in requests to support upgraded and expanded and additional capacity, that type of thing for antiquated equipment. So I hope that would be an eligible cost as stated kind of in the guidelines in plain reading for this round. We've put a significant amount of time into developing those proposals for this
Sure.
middle mile effort.
Yeah, I think we'll have to look at those and confirm with you on those what those are. But I think as long as they're not direct operational expenses, then it's probably fine. Again, it's going to be a little bit on a case by case basis. We've tried to give some guidance, and then it's up to you to work with us to show how it is not an operational expense. But if they're directly tied into this project, then I think that's something we can probably consider. So, but I will have to look at it to make sure.
Yeah, 9.2, it's the first category of eligible items, and that's how we understood it, which was network and access equipment costs, including fiber and electronics. So
Mhm. Yeah, I mean,
okay.
we don't want to deny things, but we'll have to make sure it's within the realm of compliance. But yeah, I mean, if you can clearly demonstrate it's needed, then I don't see why it would be a problem.
Yep. Or faster, more reliable. That's the goal.
Exactly.
Cool. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate
You're
it.
welcome. No problem. Let's see. Yeah, Craig, go ahead.
Hey, do you have any more thinking around 9.3 financial surety? Which middle mile projects may require financial sureties? Just because the carrying costs of those bonds are material or letter of credits involved. Uh, when you think about when you might know or how you might determine that and how we plan for that.
Right. Um, so we've talked a little bit about this internally, and I think the general consensus is it's going to be, as we work out what projects get submitted, the size of those projects, the impact they're going to have, we'll have to make a determination then as to what's required. And yeah, I mean, we're pretty vague in this. I get it. I don't have much more to add to it on this at this time. I think it's a case of submit what you want to submit, and we'll review and make sure what we're requesting makes the most sense for the project. So. Yeah, and I think when we get to the situation of going from award made to agreement executed, there's a chance for us to talk through that and negotiate about what makes the most sense. So within the guidelines that we have. So I'm sorry I don't have much more than that, but because it's a bit new to everybody, well, it's a bit new to us as well. we want to make sure we're doing this correctly. So, sorry, I don't have a better answer than that. All right. Okay. Does anyone have any other questions? Anything we can tackle? You can feel free to just come off mute if you'd like, or raise your hand, whatever works, or stick it in the chat if you prefer to. That's also fine. Kristen, can you go to the reminders slide for a quick sec, please? There we go. So I don't think there's any questions, but again, we're still here for a bit, so let us know. Do visit the Advanced Local website for any resources, review the guidelines, which you're all doing. Go through the user guide if that helps to get your application submitted. Um, Use your correct naming conventions. Those are very helpful for uploading files. And I think we mentioned it in FAQs as well, but if you reference something and you want to add additional documentation, you know, talk about it, use the naming convention in your narrative, and then upload it, into one of the upload sections that's as relevant as possible and say, I uploaded document X to the financial documentation section, just so we know what we're looking for so we can kind of connect the dots. Make sure you complete the workbook to whatever extent you can. Don't add any columns or rows. Ping us and we can get you the right one. And then of course, use the right file format. The portal should flag it for you if you try to use a different file format, but just let us know if you have any problems with that. So yeah, Mike, go ahead, please. I hope I'm saying your name right, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. Not
Thank
everybody
you.
gets it, so thank you. Yes, yeah, I just had another question since you mentioned about the workbook. There's a separate sheet in the workbook, a complete sheet about operational expenses. You had mentioned earlier on the call, and yeah, I joined late, so you might have already answered this. There's a separate sheet on the workbook, operational expenses.
Mhm.
Now, we understand operational expenses are not necessarily a part of the grant, so we have kept it blank. Is that the intent as well?
Um, that's a good question. That's a really good question, actually. I don't think I'd thought too much about that. I think when you're filling out the workbook, it's definitely important to fill it out to the best of your ability. I'm just looking at it right now, just so I can. I'm very visual, so this helps me to kind of tackle this. I think we want to understand, what costs are associated with the project in general, but I may want to just talk to my colleagues and confirm it because we don't want to misunderstand an application like, well, they've added all these operational expenses. That's not feasible. Are you on the operating cost summary tab? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, let me open it as well, but there's an
Yeah.
operating
There's
cost
there's
tab.
two. Yeah, project cash flow and operating cost summary that I'm seeing that have um some of this covered. So I think we're trying to understand what is the cost of the project in total, and then how are you using the money? Because obviously there's the match side of things as well. But I do want to come back to you on that just to make sure. So I think, in a quick answer would be if you do have operating expenses, make sure they're not, doesn't come across that you're asking for funding for those, but you may need to also let us know like how much the project costs in general.
There. And is there a role of the revenue, or you just want to understand the revenue piece of it? There's a project cash flow tab where the top line, and
Mhm.
on the previous call we had discussed about the treatment of IRUs as well. So
Mhm.
currently we are just treating it as a revenue, and that's about it.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Just kind of getting an idea of down the road how much this is going to cost. What are you looking to make it? What is there an ROI that's feasible for you? And what the source of your funds are. So I don't know if that helps. If it doesn't, please just send an email, and again, I'll do my best to address this as quickly as possible.
Sure, thank you so much.
Mhm. All right. Any other questions? I mean, I think as I've mentioned, if you have things you want to follow up on after this, please fire them off to our general inbox. I think that's advance underscore CBO. I think that's right. I never remember what it is. Let me look. Advance underscore CBO at state.co.us. Please send your emails to that. And we have folks who are, thank you, Kristen. We're folks who are tracking all the messages that come in, and we'll get to your question as quickly as possible. As I understand, there is a bit of a time crunch. So. Okay, well, I can give everyone back the gift of time if there's no other questions. As I mentioned, send off a note and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. Thanks for joining us. And we will make sure that there are answers to the FAQs. If it's not Friday, then it will be Monday morning. So we can get those answers. And if you have general questions, fire those off and we'll get those answered as quickly as possible. Otherwise, thank you for your time. Thank you, Kristen, for helping out with this. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.